The guest on today's show is Tom Atlee. Tom is a lifelong researcher and promoter of ideas and approaches for generating collective wisdom about our public affairs. He has curated and presented these ideas in an encyclopedic vision that he calls Wise Democracy. I brought Tom into this podcast because, well, there's a natural alignment with his work and vision and the goals of the Omni-Win project. And I wanted to bring his wisdom into this space. In this conversation, we talk about how he's come up with the prime directive of Wise Democracy, which can help guide change agents who are navigating the nonlinear, complex system that we know of as the whole that you and I are part of. And then we talk about processes that exist to engage diverse groups and to elicit their collective wisdom in service of the whole. And we talk about how those processes work and how they feel. And then we talk about what it might really take to bring wise democracy into reality. And one of the upshots of that is that it's not going to be about coming up with new laws or systems or projects. Instead, it's going to be about helping us recognize that we are all participating, whether we like it or not, and then thinking about how we can do that, participate both effectively and with wisdom and in service of the whole. This episode was recorded in June of the year 2022. Please enjoy this conversation with Tom Atlee.
One of the biggest developments in the last decade was the creation of a pattern language for wise democracy, which is a whole pile of interlocking design principles for creating a democratic, a participatory powered system that can generate collective wisdom. And wisdom, my definition of wisdom, working definition, is taking into account what needs to be taken into account for long-term broad benefit. There's many different ways to do that, and it's not just one thing, but that's a touchstone that's different from most definitions of wisdom, but that's what I'm meaning here. It's like, how do we figure out or sense into or manifest broad benefit, not just people, future generations, natural world, whatever, broad benefit, many different kinds of benefit for the long term. And so that's my ideal. And when I created this thing, I was just creating it intuitively. I was like, okay, so we need to have some equity. We need to be able to use differences and disturbances creatively, use people's life energy well, et cetera. There's all these different dimensions to how one would go about doing that. But it overwhelmed people. There's 96 different patterns or design elements here. And so I was searching for, where do these things come from? When I actually get out of my intuition and try to articulate what is it that holds all these very different things together as one thing. And I came up with, like, sort of jokingly called the prime directive. The prime directive is something that's on Star Trek, don't interfere in societies with their own evolutions and all that. And mine's different. And it comes from how to be a change agent in complex systems that you can't control or predict. What does it mean? Like, I come from an activist background. So what does it mean to be an activist in a scene that you can't just be linear? Can't just, there's a problem, let's solve it and move on kind of thing. There's a different energetic to realizing how complex and virtually alive practically all the systems that we're dealing with are. So what does it mean to do that and to have long-term broad benefit? What I came up with this prime directive was a guidance, which was to respect and evoke and engage the wisdom and resourcefulness of the whole on behalf of the whole. So whatever whole you're dealing with, the whole situation, the whole community, the whole world, whatever, you are assuming that inside of that, somewhere or in its potential interactivity, there is the wisdom and the resourcefulness it needs to deal with its situation and become more whole. So it's on behalf of that whole. You are trying to call this forth. And it's not okay, I've got it all planned, I know exactly what to do. It's not linear, it's a relational, how can I facilitate, catalyze the main thing that's going to deal with these, whatever the situation is out there already, buried somewhere, or it's not arrayed properly, so different parts are fighting each other. But if the different parts were actually talking together, collaborating, might we be able to generate something that was more satisfying, more healing, alive, whole? And so that's the kind of meta impulse behind all my work, is trying to comprehend the nature of the whole in different circumstances, and how to tap into or call forth what is potentially there that could serve the long-term broad benefit. And yeah, there's lots to know about what wisdom is, lots to know about what the whole is, and all that. Wholeness has like synergy. A lot of people are familiar with synergy. The things sort of fit together in a way that makes them more, you know. And there's a whole pile of other characteristics like that within wholeness. If you consider things as a whole rather than as a separate object, entity, whatever, you think of it as a whole, there's certain things about it, like synergy, that you can tap in for free resources. You know, like permaculture takes us, you have a regular farmer and a permaculture farmer, and depending on how they set up the things that exist in the system, one of them yields all sorts of stuff without toxicity, and one of them generates toxicity and doesn't yield so much, and a lot of the things in the system don't work together well. So ecology has lots to teach us about that. And group process, you know, how do we, you have diverse people, they are battling each other in some scene, and some of the most powerful group processes are taking those people and finding ways to help them hear each other, help them hear themselves, help them see more about the situation than they saw before, so that they're all looking at a bigger picture than when they walked in the room. That's now close to the whole. You know, you pulled in all the different people who are part of the scene. They're now looking at the whole scene more clearly than they saw before they walked in. And they start to try and figure out what to do about that whole scene that's more complex than they realized it was. And because they're all involved in different parts of it, they're bringing different parts that need to be taken into account. And what they come up with is something that takes account more of what needs to be taken into account in order for long-term broad benefit to happen. You know, so those are all very general things. I can describe some of the specifics of good process or whatever, but that's at the high level, to do the kind of what you call Omni-Win. You know, how does the whole succeed? How does the whole achieve more benefit for itself, which is the whole situation? And so that's been the inquiry for about 30 years now for me, and was triggered by things that happened in my life where I go, whoa, you know, this is interesting and different from the way things are generally happening. And then trying to research into that and find out more about it, and, you know, find things people can do and methods people can use and whatever.
Thank you. That's a wonderful, I think, overview of some of the work that you've been doing and some of the ways you've been thinking about it. And when we spoke last, actually, you had just recently released the pattern language deck, and there's 96 different patterns, these elements. And I love to hear that was a lot for people to handle. And so the question is, like, how can we distill this down to the operational algorithm that people can run under that would lead to wise democracy kind of coming to that prime directive? And I think that that's worth recognizing, that in a nonlinear complex system, we couldn't, for example, make 96 pieces of legislation and just, you know, shoehorn wise democracy in there, because without the the operating principle or that prime directive, it doesn't really matter. I mean, that a lot would happen if we made 96 pieces of wise democracy legislation. But the real thing is how are we thinking about we interacting? And then so you talk about this idea of respecting, evoking, and engaging the wisdom of the whole on behalf of the whole. And that speaks to me a lot. My tagline is we all have a role to play in the whole. So it's all in the same piece here. But sounds like part of your experience, and I kind of know this, is that you've actually seen diverse groups of people engage the wisdom of the whole on behalf of the whole. And I'm curious if you would be willing to just share an example of like what that looks like. And then we could talk more about how it might happen more.
Yeah. Well, there's an interesting public example that people can go to and see for themselves, kind of, which I promote a lot. There was in 1991 in Canada, there had been lots of dialogue and stuff. The country was coming apart. Quebec wanted to secede, and the people, the indigenous people, were going, "Hey, this is you're on our land. We're not just an interest group, whatever." And basically, all the different parts of Canada were very separate from each other, and nothing had really succeeded in handling that. And Maclean's magazine, that's sort of like the Time magazine of Canada, Newsweekly, glossy Newsweekly, got together with the Canadian TV to try they always thought it was just a fancy focus group, an experiment. It was very definitely an experiment. The editors were not trying to prove something. They were curious what would happen. And they hired their polling firm to find 12 people, sort of like a jury, find 12 people who represented in their diversity on a bunch of different demographic parameters the entirety of Canada. And so they got these 12 people, and they hired Roger Fisher, who is famous for co-authoring a book called Getting to Yes, Handbook on Negotiation, which was a watershed. It's like, instead of us negotiating to see how we can get the best of each other, kind of, we get on the same side of the table, talk about our legitimate interests for each of us, and then work together to satisfy those legitimate interests. The total turning everything inside out kind of thing.
Right. I mean, that's, I didn't think about that as like the foundational text of modern mediation in a way. Yeah.
Yeah. Very, very influential. And he was at Harvard, the Harvard Negotiation Project. So they go, okay, so this guy's internationally famous. He's on all this practice. Let's bring him up and see what he can do with these 12 people in a couple of days, a long weekend at a retreat center. So they did that. And there's lots of things that have been done like that, but none of them have been reported like that. So that's what I have, a poll page. I have the whole magazine on my website, co-intelligence.org. Search for Maclean's and Macleans. And yeah, I have both the TV documentary and the Maclean's man. 40 pages. I mean, yeah, I try to imagine, where has any glossy magazine spent 40 pages covering anything? It's sort of like the major whole country wiped out with nuclear bombs. Like, give 6 pages to it, and that's major. It's like, okay, this was a big deal. And after a few introductory articles, editorials, whatever, they gave bios, half-page bios of each of the 12 people, and then do a blow-by-blow account. It's almost like a transcript of a dialogue or a screenplay or something. Joe Schmo says this and whatever, for a dozen pages with photos in the magazine of the people's body language. And it starts out, people leaning back, their arms crossed, and slowly they start to lean towards each other or away from each other totally as the dialogue continues. And at the end, everybody's hugging, So it's this mixture of tracking what happens to all these people and where they get to. And then there's like 4 or 5 pages of their recommendations, their vision for Canada. And then more articles, how these people were chosen, background on the issues they were wrestling with, and blah, 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 blah. But that act of introducing you to the individuals. And what I realized when I was first reading the magazine is as you're reading these individual stories, bios, you are picking who you like and who you don't like. You're being drawn into the story through these people. And then they show you how these people interact and what's done. So you are a fly on the wall. You're a vicarious witness to what happens to these people. And what you're witnessing is a very different kind of conversation. So this is very different from most. We got a bunch of people together and then they talked for 2 days and here's what they came up with. I mean, that's all very good, but that's something that happened out there. And this is reporting pulls you into the process. And of course, it was all videoed and then the hour-long video thing. But one of the things that was interesting for me, because that was 91, and when I first heard about it was in 2000, and I hired an investigative reporter friend of mine I said, how could this not change Canada? So I hired him to go talk to the editors of Maclean's and people from Canadian TV and, and to Roger Fisher, who was alive then, he's not alive anymore. All these interviews are on my same webpage. They're linked to that thing. So you can climb into what I was seeing. But one of the things that really, and it's also in I have 4 books, 3 of them are on democracy, and all 3 of those books have chapters featuring this thing, because it's such an amazing thing. And Fisher's there with his 2 assistants from Harvard. And by the Saturday evening, it started out Friday night, and by Saturday dinner time, it's coming apart. It's just falling apart right now. And while Fisher is off looking, he knows the next day is the last day. And he and another one of his colleagues going around looking at all the chart pads from the previous conversation, looking for something he might be able to weave together to see if he can salvage something out of this mess. Meanwhile, at dinner, one of the other Harvard people is there listening at this table in dinner where a woman from Quebec is saying, you guys don't get it. You just don't get it. There's nothing we can do about this. We need to get out of Canada. And this woman from Canada listening really well to her. Is it like this? How this? Blah, blah. And finally, the Quebec woman is totally transformed by this listening and says, if this is possible, anything's possible. It's a big emotional breakthrough. And the next morning, she breaks in and says to the Indigenous woman, what's it like for you? And does the mirroring, the reflective listening that she had the night before, she does for this Indigenous woman who talks for 15 minutes about how people don't get it, And so there's this funny thing that happens where the women, there's 3 guys from Harvard, the women are doing the emotional work that makes the breakthrough for the group in terms of its stuckness. Meanwhile, the head work is being done by Fisher pulling this together. So after the morning, by Sunday morning, Fisher then presents what he's come up with so far for everybody to edit, and they spend the day going over it and editing it, and at the end they come up with their big solution. And it's like, this is not a nicey thing. This is all the conflict is right in front of your face. So it has, the human interest and conflict that the press is supposedly interested in, you need in order to sell your papers. It's right there, but something different happens with it than what we usually see happen with conflict. And my big question through the guy I hired was, what happened? What happened in the larger country? And what happened was conversation all over the country, and talk shows dragging politicians in to say, what do you think of this? Why aren't we doing more of this? And then pulling in the prime minister, the prime minister going, whoa, we got to cool this down. It's a little too hot, And so the politicians put oil on the water and everything calms down. It fades away. And what I realized and what I write about on that page is Maclean's, because they didn't realize it was a democratic innovation, they thought of it as a focus group, as an event. But if they had done the same thing the next year, the fact that the politicians had squashed it would probably have come up as part of the conversation. If it's an iterative thing, it's like our elections, they're iterative. There's a feedback loop going on all the time. But McLean's didn't think in those terms. So they just said, what an interesting thing happened here, rather than becoming a force for we, the people, to think together for a weekend once a year and report back to ourselves, what we're seeing. It would have changed the context within all the politics in Canada was happening. So that's like an archetypal example of what could be lots of things. We have processes now. It's a thing called dynamic facilitation, which is sort of my favorite process for digesting conflict. And it actually doesn't work unless there's conflict, because I've watched several cases where there wasn't really conflict and it didn't go particularly anywhere. But when there's a hot conflict, it just is, it's a breakthrough machine. And I can say more if you want about how that works, but if I was doing a McLean's experiment now, I would not do the principal negotiation, which is what the Harvard Negotiation Project does, but I would do dynamic facilitation. And what would be the way to publicize it? Now we have all the social media. It's like we're in a different world now, but they modeled using what was available at the time, the leading edge at the time, something that was profoundly influential and powerful and demonstrated possibilities that most people don't even know exist. So by my research, I know a whole pile of other possibilities exist. And the question is how to help people see that those possibilities are real.
Yeah, I love this example. I mean, and I recognize that it's like working for us in a couple of ways. One thing I want to pick out is that people, once they started engaging with each other and then like authentically listening to each other and being curious, that there's a transformational experience for all sorts of people. And that you could see that transformation happening for the individuals going through the process as they started to feel heard, or as they like open to hearing other people's perspectives. And then of course there was the transformation of them all having their disagreements and then coming out with some suggestions. So there's this transformation happening. And part of that was that head work and the heart work. I think that's really worth lifting up, that we're not, it's one thing. I mean, actually, I was just recently doing some conflict resolution for a group where we got too far away from the heart work and we got ourselves too lost in a spreadsheet of whatever and of decision points, and it burned people out. There has to be that space for that human connection, for people to have the meal, to listen for a whole 15 minutes to someone. Actually, I always like pointing out, if you're having a hard time getting someone to listen to you, listen to them until they're embarrassed about it. And then they'll listen to you. I just like getting the person to the point where they're like, oh, wow, you actually really know what I'm talking about now. Wait, what did you want to say? Anyways, but that aside, there's two pieces of this that you talk about. And I know that we both have like an interest in sort of representative sample, citizen assembly kind of work. So this was 12 people representing all of Canada. Now, of course, that's a tight sample set for a huge country. And then there also was this piece about the impact on, like the impact that it actually had, but specifically the impact on politicians, right? And so, I know about citizen assembly as this, as a potential process that we can use to deal with complex policy issues, or we could get a representative sample, kind of like a jury, to have a conversation about the topic, a deliberative, thoughtful process using dynamic facilitation, World Cafe, all these different possibilities, and then coming up with ideas. And the idea is that those ideas could influence our politicians. But that's something that doesn't always happen. So I'm just curious if you'd be willing to unpack a bit about this model of like getting the representative sample, and what do you see as the things that work around that or that aren't working around that as a tool?
There's more experimenting happening on how to do the sample, and there's lots of theoretical discussions. Should it be purely random? If you do a purely random selection with no sorting for demographics, you will end up covering the ground over time. But if you're going to do an event on one issue, for example, you really need to do some kind of demographic filter. And there's ways, different ways to do that too, but that's the basic principle. And how many people do you need? I guess I've seen a couple of examples where there were like 6 or 10 people, but usually it doesn't, based on the model of jury system, which is familiar in most of our Western systems. And it turns out the 12 people on a jury is from British common law. And the reason there's 12 is because Jesus had 12 disciples. That's where the 12
I kind of
comes
figured
from.
that was why there was 12. Yeah.
So there's, but most of the citizen assemblies, which is currently the popular mode, they have, I think 30 is probably the lowest I've seen, and it's gone up to like 120 or 160, usually between 80 and 100. They just did a major one in Austria on climate, which had 100 people, and selected at random with what they call a stratified sample, where their goal is to have these people who are selected at random, a large pool is selected at random, and then everybody in the pool sends in their demographic data, and then people are picked from that randomly selected pool to represent, to be able to mirror the demographic percentages that exist in the community or the society. So you're getting a microcosm of the whole, what's come to be called in professional circles a mini public. It's a mini version of the public. And once you have that mini public, then you can give them privileged access to information that is, I mean, privileged in the sense that most people out in the world trying to figure it out don't necessarily have adequate information across the boards. And then there's a question of how much information do you actually include? And that's hotly debated in some circles. It's like, okay, we're going to have a climate assembly. Should there be climate denier scientists as part of the briefing people or not? And since I'm trying to evoke and engage the wisdom and resourcefulness of the whole, I go, we need to get the climate denier people in there so that when the climate deniers out in the world look at the conference, at this citizen assembly, they can go, oh, my kind of people and my ideas are represented here. Let's see what they did with it. Rather than, no, they didn't have my people, so this is a biased sample. But there's other people say climate is too urgent. We need to, give a variety of information to people, educate them about climate dynamics and all the rest, because we can't dilute that with with this denier shit. So there's different perspectives being battled out, but the idea is to give people a good spectrum of opinion. How broad that spectrum is debatable, but there's general agreement. You're giving people a broad spectrum of different approaches, different information. And so people look at that information, and for climate assemblies, as opposed to like what happened with McLean's, the one in Austria just was wrapping up this month, and they did one weekend every month for 6 months. They started in January and are wrapping up in June. And so that's a lot of time being put in, a lot of time in between for people to do more thinking and research on their own. And they did a number of innovations in that one. The people, part of what's nice about what they did in many climate assemblies is involving the people in choosing, the deliberators in choosing what kind of experts they want to talk to. Who do they want to talk to get the information they're looking for after they start discussing it. And they would look at to what extent did they already agree, and to what extent did they need to wrestle with it really hard because there were some serious differences between them in order to come up with something. And they chose dynamic facilitation for the things that they were going to be wrestling with that were hard. So that was an interesting choice. And just the idea of having different processes for different situations. Usually you have the same process all the way through. So that was an interesting breakthrough. So there's innovations, and there's a a technology called Polis, Polis, where people, anybody, it's a called participatory poll is the category, and it's a polling, but the things on the poll come from the participants. So you have a thing like what's the most important thing we should do for climate or take into account when we're dealing with climate, and so anybody can toss in their ideas about that. You can involve thousands of people in doing that, and there's an AI algorithm in the background that's looking at categorizing people, sort of like the Amazon says, people who read this book also were interested in this book kind of thing. You're being put in a category because of certain patterns in how you responded. And so usually it's 2 or 3 groups that the AI is grouping people into. And while it's doing that, it is looking for, among the groups, not necessarily among the whole, but among the groups, where are points of the biggest disagreement or agreement. Because people are inputting for each one of the statements, it's being tossed up, okay, do you agree, disagree, or pass on this statement? And so thousands of people are putting their little votes like that. There's no discussion. It's really weird. There's no discussion. They discovered that discussion generates the kind of ridiculousness that happens in comment sections. So they've had the algorithm is looking for, between this group that seems to be all the liberals and this group which seems to be all the conservatives, what do they agree on? That just shows up statistically in the process of doing this. So without any discussion, it's clarifying what's the landscape of opinion on this issue, including consensus statements, which is a wild thing. I've never run into anything which has no discussion and can generate consensus. And they're not saying this should make a decision on anything, but that information is really useful information for something like a citizen assembly or other randomly selected group of people who's given, okay, here's a really interesting piece of the data picture. What do you want to do with that? So they'd use that it was nationally announced in a national magazine, and the government, it's all government sponsored, saying, here's a thing anybody can participate in, come on down, So that was another part of the citizen assembly on climate in Austria. I'm really interested in how it's going to come out, and there's lots of nuances, good and bad, going on in that. But there's a sense of people trying stuff out within any given model that I really like.
I was thinking, what I was going to say about earlier before you started telling the story was that, yeah, it's unfortunate that there's not enough of all these different processes happening that we can start doing just more experiments, right? Like, oh, let's do a version where they have this much information. Let's do a version that have that much information. And, but it sounds like in this Austria project that they're trying it out, and I'll look forward to seeing what happens too. So I'll look into that. So we have a process where we can get like a demographic sampling of the population, and we're representative sampling. We can give them a deliberative, thoughtful process with like lots of information. And I love how you explain like the privileged information, but really it's not just like, really, we're going to make sure that you have answers to all the questions that you have, and we're going to give you lots of good information. We're going to give you access to experts and all sorts of things. And give you the time to really think about it, right? Because that's the part that, even, a regular citizen doesn't get a chance to do. And actually, honestly, our representative politicians don't really often get a chance to do. And so to really think it all through, and I love that bringing
and
in
engage with each other, engage with the differences.
Yeah.
Another thing is we tend to stay inside our informational bubbles, and the thing called confirmation bias. We tend to absorb information that confirms what we think. Everybody in the system is doing that, and you can't ever get together and actually wrestle with the differences and come up with something that's bigger.
Yeah, and I think that's something that actually another guest I'm going to be talking about, Mickey Cashton, who I think you probably know, and the way she talks about like the value of dissent and the importance of bringing in the dissenters. Like, why is this person not happy with this? And you bring him in now, or you're going to bring him in later?
or they're going to come in later, whether you want them there or not.
Exactly. As I call it, the second rule of conflict is whoever is involved in the conflict has to be involved in the solution, or they're going to involve themselves on their own terms. So a bigger question here, and so we have the tools, and you've been an amazing collector of them. And we see the possibilities, and we see the experiments, and so forth. And I'm very conscious of the fact that with the Omni-Win project, in a certain way, I'm kind of stepping into your shoes and we're stepping onto your shoulders as a collector of all of this information and trying to bring more awareness to it. So I guess I'm curious, like, what's your hypothesis on why this hasn't broken out into the larger population, and like, what can we do to overcome this? Like, how do we actually get people to pay attention to these possibilities?
Well, I don't know. There's a way. I mean, we each do what we can. I think of myself even more as a curator than a collector. Part of is collecting, but also organizing, highlighting, presenting. And the pattern language, every pattern has a web page associated with it. And on that web page are resources and examples. And I have information behind the scenes that's not on the web page, which is I'm always accumulating more and more resources and examples for every pattern. But the more I put on there, the more confusing the whole thing gets. My dream is of somebody recognizing its importance as a new body of knowledge. I mean, the site is encyclopedic in its extent. And I live 5 blocks from the University of Oregon, and I see all these students paying tens of thousands of dollars to study things which are going to help them succeed in the civilization that's destroying the planet. But the stuff that I've been digging around and organizing has the capacity to play a role in not destroying the planet, but it's from another paradigm. It's from a holistic paradigm. It's not, you're not in separate boxes. It's like, here's a whole, and theoretically, people could study that whole and apply it, but that's all theory. Sometimes I think that things have to fall apart and cease to function at all before people will make the leap from and it's like hitting the alcoholics hitting bottom, whatever they say. That's when the change happens. At the same time, civilization hitting bottom means you are missing resources that you need to, at the point where the supply chains break down and there's no food and tornadoes are going through your neighborhood, it's like, it's going to be hard to have citizen political councils convened. So my other hope is for people who are already oriented towards taking action, the quote unquote activists or change agents, to realize that they are trying to put their solutions and resolutions into systems that are not designed to deal well with those. And to go spending all our resources on symptoms of the problem rather than the causes. And to what extent can many of those people, the funders of those people, whatever, start looking at how do we change the systems so that they're capable of supporting the collective intelligence and wisdom of the community and the society and making good use of all the work of the change agents. And how could change agents realize that? And okay, I'm working on climate, I'm working on racism, I'm working on whatever, and I'm going to include, tithing 10% of my effort and time and money and whatever to actually serve efforts by all of us to transform the systems in ways like this. I think of it sort of out-Gandhi and Gandhi, to evoke and engage the wisdom and resourcefulness of the whole on behalf of the whole. If you're including everybody, including your opponents, in the action of figuring out what to do, then it's hard to resist that. Gandhi made it hard for the British to maintain their empire. Whenever they did the things that maintained their empire, it backfired on them, and they had to end up playing on Gandhi's playing field. And there's something that we who are trying to, you know, get not get control, but get help life figure out how to make it through the things that are coming down the pike. Those people who have that impulse to think in terms of how to engage the whole in benefiting the whole, if we can do that really successfully, it changes things. And there's another thing that's emerging. I know we're getting really close to our end of our time, but it's something that's emerging by itself, which has run under the moniker MS3, multi-sector, multi-stakeholder, multi-scale networks collaborating in a particular issue zone, healthcare, food, whatever. And several years ago, two of my colleagues, one of whom was already my colleague and one of whom was emergent colleague, noticed that this was happening all by itself. So you have the people who are fighting or not coordinating, who are working in that zone. They're all co-creating what's happening, but not in any way connected to each other. If you can get them to start working together, then they're creating good things in the zone instead of things that don't work in the zone and bad things. And that is emerging all by itself. The Sustainable Development Goals, those things are happening. And there's some consultants who are realizing, hey, I'm trying to make this happen. And that's just what I'm doing. And noticing, there's lots of this happening, but there's only a few people noticing this is a new form of governance. It includes government, because like government regulators are part of any one of these things, et cetera. But it doesn't depend on governments. It depends on the whole system. The idea of the whole system in the room, the whole system handling the whole system, that's a whole nother branch of democracy, which most of the people dealing with democracy don't recognize.
Right.
So that's some hope in that too, particularly the fact that it's happening by itself.
Yeah, there's a lot there because this is why I kind of call myself like a pesta optimist, is because right now we're pessimism for sure. We're about to go right off the cliff. We're going fast and accelerating, and the optimism that I have is, wow, it seems like all we need to do is like tweak a couple of different modes of thinking, and we would start changing our course. But that's what I hear, is that like when people take on this prime directive in a way and start trying to figure out how to engage the whole in order to find what's best for the whole, and then naturally act based on that, right? Like, interact with the others around them, then they'll start creating more connection. I value your perspective. You have an important piece for me. We need this person in here. And that has the capacity to create emergent phenomenon of people who are actually caring or interested in the thing. And since, as you were saying before, like activism so often focuses on like, let's go deal with the symptoms, or let's go tweak the system, but they're still playing within the system, that the best way to get out of the system is to kind of shift the lens of thinking, and bigger things come out of that. And I was hearing that you mention this helps me understand, because I mentioned earlier your 5 fields of co-intelligence, right? So we have like the individuals, we have the relationships, the systems. You talk about nature, which I've heard other people, another colleague of mine flags that. But then you talk about this dance of the universe. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is a lot, right, to take in. But part of it is the Tao. And there's a way that if you're engaging with this prime directive, trying to engage everyone in service of everyone, then something will happen there that is beyond our own ability to make it happen. That's why we can't make the 96 pieces of legislation.
Yes, and there's another piece of that, which I call intrinsic participation, which is the realization that we're participating all the time in everything, whether we know it or not, want to or not, like it or not. And that changes the focus. The idea of guilt, for example, looks kind of ridiculous in that. There are multiple causes and multiple effects in complex systems, and we're in the middle of that. And we can shift how we participate, but we can't not participate. Not participating is a form of participation. And there's a way in which coming to terms with that is a really interesting exercise. So it's not we need to get more people to participate. We need to figure out how to shift how people are engaging in what things are, including ourselves, and getting more sophisticated at that. That's part of the dance of the universe. Is everything is, what's a co-incarnation? It's a co-incarnational universe. David Spangler says. It's like we're all bringing each other and everything else into being, and how to live in that awareness and be an activist in that awareness.
Right. Yeah, just recognize I am participating. I have a role to play in the whole. How do I want to do it? Is this what the contribution I want to be making? And I think part of what you were saying about like that guilt or responsibility is that it's also about like a lot of people get engaged with things because they start feeling guilty about not doing it. But that's not necessarily the point. Guilt isn't going to get us very far anyways. No one wants to ride on the shame train to utopia. Everyone wants to get on the come feel bad about how messed up you are and help us fix it. No. Yeah. Tom, thank you. Any last words or anything that you think that I or people who are listening should pay attention to as we're trying to work on these topics and carry your mantle forward?
Well, I can invite people to look at the Wise Democracy Pattern Language, wd-pl.com, and there's a little card deck that goes with it. You can fiddle with. You can download it for free or buy it as a package deck. And my blog, tomattleeblog.com, has a lot of more current kinds of digestions of developments. Story that goes with my pattern language is like, what was it, 4 years ago, I had a heart attack. And as I was being wheeled into the emergency room, my one thought was, thank God I got the pattern language done. That was, at that time, that was my dump of 30 years of my work, everything I could think of to put in. So it's a lot of stuff densely packed in there. And if anybody wanted to actually study it and engage some people in a class or something, I'd be happy to participate with anybody that has real interest in learning about it. So that's there. But I create this stuff, curate this stuff, but I don't know how to promote it. I'm not a promoter kind of person. I can inspire people with some examples and all the rest, but pushing it into wide use and realization is not my capacity. So anybody who has those capacities, wants to make videos that promote this stuff or whatever, there's lots of opportunity. Step through the looking glass.
Well, we should definitely follow up on that because I think that's part of, what I'm trying to figure out is like, where do people really need right now? How do we get the word out? And I want to, put a huge recommendation for checking out the Pattern Language website. It is, I mean, honestly, I feel envious of the resource that it is. Part of me was like also have been gathering articles and things like that and trying to organize them. And I'm like, wow, I could almost never do more than this. Every one of the cards has a video that goes with it, a bunch of practice questions, a transcript, and then a list of at least like 30 different resources or articles. And that's just the surface layer of your blog from decades of work. So I encourage folks to check it out, and you can find them in the show notes, wherever you're listening to this. Tom, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Thank you so much for listening to the Omni-Win Project podcast. Today's episode is with Tom Atlee. Tom is the founder of the Co-Intelligence Institute and the creator of the Wise Democracy Pattern Language. I am super grateful for Tom for coming into this show and today for reminding us about how finding the collective wisdom is work that will include both our head and our heart. And of course, I'm also grateful to Tom for the amazing work he's done over the years to curate the elements of Wise Democracy. And if you want to check that out, and I encourage you to, you can find links to the Wise Democracy Pattern Language in the show notes. And while you're there, I encourage you not to forget to subscribe to the podcast because you don't want to miss any of the episodes that are coming soon, where we're going to continue breaking down the status quo, democracy, and political culture, and trying to figure out how we can create wise democracy. And if you want even more information, just come on down to the website at omni-win.com. And there you can find essays and videos and all sorts of resources in service of the co-creation of our future, of our democracy. So as you go off into your day and you start to engage with the active work of co-creating our future, I encourage you to remember that we all have a role to play in the whole. Or, in the words of Tom Atlee's prime directive, how today can you engage with, evoke, and respect the wisdom of the whole in service of the whole? Thank you so much for listening to the Omni-Win Project podcast. Have a wonderful day.